Trump speaks so many falsehoods, and we have to ask ourselves, why is it people are ready to believe falsehoods? And I guess my theory is that they actually know he's lying. They know he's exaggerating. They know that nothing grounds many of his claims, but they're thrilled with the idea that he's able to say whatever he wants, even though there's no evidence to support it, and even though it's incoherent. So I think we haven't thought enough about that right-wing that right-wing thrill, that sense of exhilaration. They want to be free to hate. They want to be free to be irrational. And he represents that very dangerous and misguided form of liberation.
I think I've done something like 250 of these now.
Wow.
Most of them have been with philosophers, but most of them have been with analytic philosophers, since I'm in a more analytically oriented philosophy department.
Right.
And I always ask how my guests got into philosophy, and it seems like with analytic philosophy, they got into it either through math or physics. That seems to be the rule. And I'm wondering how it is that you got into philosophy.
Through the synagogue.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, how did that happen?
Through my rabbi. Well, I had a slight altercation with a student in the synagogue. I went weekly to Hebrew classes, and I didn't have a physical altercation, but I made a grimace, and that person made a grimace, or I was responding to a grimace, and we were considered to be disrespectful. But I took the brunt of it, apparently, and I was sent to the rabbi. The rabbi, however, was a scholar, and he said he wasn't letting me back into the classroom and that I had to take a tutorial with him, and what was it that I would like to read. So I told him I wanted to know why Spinoza was excommunicated from the synagogue, because I was clearly identifying with Spinoza at the moment. But I was also interested in existential theology, and I was interested in the question of whether German idealism was in some sense responsible for Nazism. Like, what are the lines? Anyway, I had been doing a lot of reading on my own, but that rabbi took me seriously as a young person who was probably not a criminal. And we worked together, and he then recommended that I attend some philosophy classes at the local university, which I did.
Well, maybe I should have said that as a close third after math and physics, it was religion that got people into analytic philosophy. It seems, though, that among analytic philosophers, it's atheism that gets them into philosophy. So maybe they were born into a Christian or Jewish family, and then they found themselves questioning whether or not there's a God, and these deeper questions led them to philosophy. Were you somebody who believed in God during your time in the synagogue?
No, but in general, the sense was in the synagogue that if there had been a God, he certainly abandoned us. So there was a kind of a negative theological mood, if you will. We were abandoned by God, or we didn't look to God. We looked to something called Jewish ethics, and ethics interested me because every time you walked into one of those discussions, there were examples, and you could take sides, and you could look at it from different perspectives. In fact, the first two courses I took at university while in high school were analytic. They were introduction to philosophy, and then introduction to moral philosophy.
I have a cousin who's getting a PhD at Stony Brook in the continental tradition. I believe, and I should know this, that he's studying somebody by the name of Levinas, who I've actually seen you've written about this person as well. And something that he has often said to me is he doesn't understand how somebody can do ethics or metaphysics or whatever it is in the analytic tradition. He only understands how you could do it in the continental tradition. And I find myself wondering also how ethics could be done in the continental tradition, as somebody who hasn't taken continental
I
ethics
see.
classes.
Well, I'm not sure I hold to a strict divide between analytic and continental.
Okay.
I think it used to be a fiercely defended distinction, but I don't think that's quite true because analytic philosophers can bring their own approach to Marx or to Hegel or even to Freud. And so none of those authors are necessarily continental, even though they are European. They can be read and argued about within analytic philosophical frameworks. And certainly also, I think that a lot of philosophy of language was of interest to people trained through Husserl, who himself was a logician and in constant academic interchange with some of the most important philosophers of mathematics within the analytic tradition, right? So you find an amazing crossover in the early Husserl. One would say, oh, Husserl is analytic. It's like, well, look at logical investigations and see what he has to say about math. So, I think there's a lot more crossing over, especially in applied ethics or in social and political philosophy. Of course, I defend the European traditions of what we would call critical theory, Hegel, Marx, Kant. But Kant also, everyone reads Kant. There's that belongs neither to continental nor analytic. I mean, we perhaps do it in slightly different ways, or some people do mix the two, or find ways of bridging those traditions, which I also find interesting. But your question was, how does one get into ethics? I'm not sure I understood myself as a youngster, right, as a teenager in the continental tradition. I picked up Kierkegaard, and I started to read Kierkegaard, either or, and then some of his other work, which was about the question how to live, how to live or how to affirm life, how to avert despair. So you could say that his work raised many theological questions, and I've seen him taught still in schools of theology. But he was also posing questions in a way that were not traditionally religious. In fact, they came from doubt.
With regard to your comments on the analytic continental divide, I've spoken to philosophers and known philosophers who feel both ways about it. So Graham Priest is one name that comes to mind, who's a very prominent analytic philosopher who also works on figures like Heidegger, or even he delves into Buddhist philosophy, and he views them all as on a par in a certain way. But then, of course, there are other philosophers analytic philosophers who claim that people like Heidegger and Hegel are unreadable. But you mentioned German idealism earlier, and then also Husserl. And I know you worked at the beginning on German idealism and phenomenology. And phenomenology is actually a word that I see cropping up all the time in analytic philosophy now,
Yes.
which seems like a bit of a blending. But toward transitioning to talk of gender, I'm wondering, just another background question, how this work on idealism, ethics, phenomenology turned into work on gender and ultimately gender trouble.
I see. Well, I set out to write a book on the philosophical foundations of gender because I thought, actually coming out of phenomenology, that there were some queer questions for sure, but also clear questions about whether, in Husserl's terms, gender is built in a step-by-step way. I mean, how does the phenomenon of gender come into being if we're not, if we don't come into the world fully gendered? how is it accomplished over time? And Husserl did have a way of thinking about constitutive acts, that is to say, those acts that that built or formed phenomenon over time. And he thought that with the appropriate methods, you could get a close look at what those acts were. So I perhaps borrowed from Husserl a bit in thinking that gender was a stylized repetition of acts, and that's one of the formulations from Gender Trouble that that I think has a strong echo of phenomenology in it.
So the phenomenon of gender is a stylized repetition of acts. That's one way of defining it.
That was one formulation that I offered in the late 1980s. Yeah.
And of course, I really want to talk about your book that came out in March, Who's Afraid of Gender? But before we get to that, I'm wondering why you felt the need to write this new book 30 years after putting forth your theory of gender.
Yeah. Well, the new book is not a theory of gender. It's actually trying to understand why so many right-wing groups, and also, sadly, some feminist groups, are opposed to gender. They call it an ideology, by which they mean false consciousness or a form of deluded thinking. But sometimes by ideology, they mean totalitarian or a doctrine that is in the course of being indoctrinated into young children or youth more broadly. And so gender had no longer meant anything that I had intended or that I knew about from gender studies or women's studies. It had taken on a new cultural form as an enemy of conservative or traditional religious Christians for the most part, but not exclusively, but also had become a figure that Governor DeSantis and Trump and other people, Bolsonaro, Meloni in Italy, certainly Viktor Orban in Hungary, they use it to say gender is a threat to humanity, or it's a threat to the very idea of man or woman. It's a threat to civilization as we know it. So stoking fears and anxieties among people who, for other reasons, feel like the world they know is falling apart, and being told, or telling those people rather, that gender is responsible for their anxiety about the future of the world.
Yeah, I'm not somebody who, and this is not a good thing, but I don't spend that much time watching or reading the news.
Yeah.
I'm too busy with other things, but it is certainly very hard to escape what you've just been describing. I mean, the banning of gender studies or critical theory
or critical race theory,
right,
or histories of slavery, or the defunding of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And it is interesting that all of these things go together. But maybe we should focus a little bit on the theory of gender performativity and how different groups think about gender to better understand the so-called phantasm that people are creating when they're fighting against gender.
Actually, I'm not sure performativity can help us understand the phantasm.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, performativity was a theory that I introduced 35 years ago, and I kind of drew back from, and I've revised in many ways over the years. But there might be an idea about what gender performativity is that opponents of gender have that has very little to do with what anyone has ever written on it.
Sure. Well, maybe I should ask then what your current theory of gender is.
Oh, I don't have one.
You don't
Sorry,
have one.
I'm not useful in that way.
Okay, interesting.
No.
Then maybe we ought to try to characterize the way that these opponents of gender studies and women's studies, how they characterize people or philosophers and thinkers like your views on gender.
Yeah. Well, I think, let me say that what concerns me is that gender is a term that is used in law, gender discrimination law. Gender is a term used in policy, trying to establish equal education for young women and men. It's used in the idea of gender-based violence. It's also used in the idea of gender identity, which is important for a lot of trans people. So gender now has many different meanings. So for me, what's most important is to understand what's going on when people are talking about gender. So you might say that I have a kind of pragmatic approach to gender at this point. Like, what are people saying? What are people meaning when they talk about gender? And it turns out they mean all kinds of things.
Right.
Okay, so there's a clustering of meanings, like, oh, gender is dangerous. It's like, wow, what's happening? Well, there's the fear of the future, fear of totalitarianism, fear of what's happening in education, fear of need for an authoritarian who will come down and order it all and restore us to a traditional way of life. I mean, I think meanings get clustered around terms like gender or even race. So people mean different things by them, and it's important to take the time, patiently, to parse, what is being meant and how very different it is. And it turns out that many of the people who oppose gender are quite contradictory in their views. For instance, they will say in one breath that gender is hyper-capitalist, like, oh, you can become any gender you want, that it's radical choice. On the other hand, they say it's totalitarian, that these are doctrine that are being imposed on youth. So it's either a totalitarian state structure or it's hyper-capitalism, but it's really hard to be both at once. It's not impossible, I suppose. We could think about that. But I think folks who are against gender or interested in making it into something very fearsome, they collect anxieties from different parts of the population, and they cluster them there. So people who then join an anti-gender ideology movement are impassioned. They think they're saving the world, but they're actually destroying a term we need for equality, for justice, for freedom, to fight violence and rape, to enable recognition and legal rights for gender nonconforming people. So they actually end up stripping people of rights and undermining some of the most progressive legislation. So I try to take a patient attitude towards what's going on and just distinguish among the senses of gender that are being used and what they're being used for.
I'm sorry if I'm being obtuse
No,
about this.
not at all.
This isn't my area, and I mean, I've spoken about sex and gender with friends, done a little bit of reading about it, but it's not something that I'm totally knowledgeable about, and I'm just going to assume that it's new to a lot of our listeners as well. So what I'd like to understand, I mean, even given that you don't have a theory, maybe there are some things that theorists in the area generally agree on about what gender is and what differentiates it from sex. I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, well, I think that probably in the feminism of the 1970s and early 80s, there was a distinction, a theoretical distinction between sex, understood as a biological reality, and gender, understood as the social or cultural interpretation of that reality. So, for instance, when Simone de Beauvoir says one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one, she's suggesting, well, you're born possibly female, but you become a woman, which is a cultural and social process, even a project or a kind of accomplishment. It suggests a developmental model of some kind, or it suggests an open-ended practice of freedom. But I think we've become smarter about biology in the last years, and we understand that the positivist view of biological facts doesn't really work very well, because our genetic structure, our endocrinological structure are all affected by environment, and also in turn have an effect on the environment. So at least in developmental biology, there are interactive models that are quite important for thinking about sex. And we know the Olympics is always having to figure out who can compete where and how, and what's fair and just, and how do we make determinations of this kind. And it turns out there's quite a lot of variation at the chromosomal level, and there's certainly variation at the hormonal level, such that you can find very accomplished male athletes, that is to say, assigned male at birth, who have less testosterone than some women who are maybe in the middle of their competitive rank. So it's really hard to settle the matter. It seems like there are social and even political issues engaged in the very assignment of sex. So in the hospital, or the legal policies that regulate sex assignment, there are certain kinds of criteria, and you need certain kinds of people to be able to say this is male, this is female. And it turns out to be kind of interesting how that's done, and what the options are. So for people with mixed genitalia, they have to be put in one box or another, with the option of changing later. A lot of trans people change later. And there are, as you know, public debates about whether something like sex is immutable and should be regarded that way, or whether it's an assignment which can be reassigned.
Since you bring up the Olympics, and they were quite recent, they're topical, many of my friends have mentioned to me that their parents bring this up to them, which I find interesting. And their parents often end up saying something like, why can't trans people just have their own leagues, their sports leagues? So you have men, women, and trans people. And my question for you is, obviously this is a big public issue. And how do you believe that it should be solved, these issues with the Olympics?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a pragmatic question and then an ideal question.
Yeah. Well, the truth is, I think they probably have to be solved on a case-by-case basis, because there's a lot of, there's a difference between being intersex and being trans. If you're intersex, you're actually born with a combination, or you might have an extra chromosome, or high or low testosterone. And then if you're trans, well, you might be taking gender confirming medication, and then that has to be taken into account. But I mean, I think first of all, it's important to note that less than 2% of athletes are trans, so they can't have their own league. I mean, it would be like a very funny league, and they're not all in the same sport, right? So you might find somebody over in boxing and somebody else in running, but they can't be in the same competition because they're not competing for the same thing. It's very rare to find more than one person who's trans or intersex in any given sport. So a solution like that wouldn't really work. I think that the ideals have to be equality and inclusion. And some people say, well, it's not fair to women who are assigned female at birth to compete against trans women who are assigned male at birth, and very possibly have had a different kind of training or a different level of testosterone. At the same time, we don't want to say trans people can't compete, or there's no place for you in the Olympics, right? So we have a question of equality and a question of inclusion, and I would like to see international Olympic boards proclaim their commitment to both and find solutions, then look at solutions that would fulfill both ideals. I can't tell you exactly what those should be, but I think looking at each individual sport and then looking at each person who poses a challenge for them would be wise, and to bring those kinds of principles to bear without compromise, quite frankly.
These are clearly very important questions, but it is surprising and unfortunate that they rise to the level of prominence that they do, especially garnering the ridicule that they do. But I think this is where Who's Afraid of Gender comes in. But before we get there, with regard to that Simone de Beauvoir quotation, gender isn't something we're born with, it's something that we become.
Or assume.
And my question is that...
But we don't really believe that anymore, but go ahead.
Right, okay. Most people, so my parents' generation, my grandparents, do believe that gender is something that's set in stone, and they equate it with sex. I mean, I don't want to say that everybody's doing this. This is changing as well. But what I'm wondering is, if this is not the case, why is it that people seem to have always believed this? Is this where a Marxist analysis might be helpful, or psychoanalysis, or maybe you just think I'm wrong?
I think you might be wrong.
Okay.
I think there are native cultures in which there have always been third spirits.
Okay, true.
I think there are a variety of South African vernaculars that allow for different forms of gender without using that word, depending on the social role and the meaning that somebody has in the context of their community and family or larger kinship organization. And I could give you many examples. I mean, the truth is that people who don't fall into either category, including the so-called hermaphrodites studied by John Money, have always been excluded from society, or shamed, or sequestered, sent away. So in previous generations, it was just considered to be shameful if you didn't have the proper morphology. You just had to be hidden. So what we then end up taking for granted is a naturalized sense of reality that has depended on shame and exclusion in order to appear natural. So the ridicule you hear, ridicule of trans people, is linked to contempt, hatred, but also crimes against trans people, vicious crimes, harassment, and murder. We see very high rates of murder in several countries in the world, especially in Brazil, for instance, where it starts as ridicule and it ends up in a violent attack and a death. So...
Weren't you also recently attacked in Brazil?
I was attacked in 2017. Luckily, they didn't get to me physically, but they did threaten me physically because they believed that I was the founder of the idea of gender and that I was a demonic force.
They literally believed this?
Yes.
Interesting. It sounds like it was a religious conviction?
Well, it was a politicized religious conviction. I mean, there are all sorts of traditional religious people who say sex is sex, or a family should be a man and a woman, who live with that idea, but they're not going to take to the streets or try to hurt somebody if they have a different opinion.
What sort of event was this?
It was on the future of democracy.
Okay.
It had nothing to do with gender.
Okay. It was just sort of an organized...
Yeah, it was called the Ends of Democracy. It was a critical theory association.
Interesting. Well, I totally walked into being wrong there when I said that for all time people have thought there was this immutable gender dichotomy. I shouldn't have said that because I was certainly excluding other cultures. I should have been much more specific and said maybe in Western cultures, or at least the Western culture I know, it has always seemed that way since I was a child. And I think there
Yes,
are,
many of us are taught that, and we
yeah,
live in a world where that's the abiding supposition. But for intersex people, right, and they didn't choose their condition, um, and a lot of trans people also feel like they have not chosen their condition. Um, uh, the boxes we use or the perceptions we make about what is natural and right and inevitable don't include them as living human beings. So we either can change our categories and become more humane, or we insist on our categories and they suffer feeling less than human.
But what I wanted to ask was why you think it is that we're all brought up, taught this way. Why this is
Well, maybe
something.
not everybody is. Maybe in certain cultures we're brought up
Right,
to
right.
think that
In
way.
our culture. And I'm wondering.
I don't know if we share a culture at this moment, though. When you say in our culture,
Okay.
are we talking about the U.S.? Are we talking about the Western or Northern Hemisphere? I'm not sure where we are when you
Sure.
say
I
that.
guess I am just thinking of United States, my peers growing up in Chicago, being here. I mean, people my age don't think this way now, but it does seem to be how we were taught.
But if you had grown up on the outside of that and you saw everybody believing that and acting as if it was true and necessary, and you were on the outside of that, you probably felt fear, shame, less than worthy, less than human. Um, you might have feared violence. You might have looked for company, among others who were on the outside of that assumption. But for a long time, we thought black people didn't deserve citizenship in the United States, and it was considered an naturally to be the case. It seemed like a shared cultural assumption. For a long time, we thought women were inferior to men, and it was just that way. But there are times where you then meet people or have experiences where some of those fundamental suppositions that you always thought were true or that were in fact shared among your peers get called into question. That's part of the reason we like education, right? And defend it, because we all come to college and university with certain ideas of what's true and real and necessary. And very often we read things or we encounter people who make us rethink what we took to be clearly the case.
Right. And just to clarify, I'm not trying to suggest that because this is something I was taught that it's correct. That's absolutely not
I understand.
what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is whether what sort of power structures, if that's what it is, perpetuate this belief and inculcation.
Well, religion, law, uh, health, um, uh, many things.
And I guess cui bono. I mean, who is benefiting from this? If it's maybe it's
Well,
disembodied or an institution is benefiting from this.
I think I think that there are forms of domination. Um, um, we could call them patriarchal, for instance, that assume that men and women are distinct and that there's a natural hierarchy between them and that they both have distinct roles. And that there are only two and nothing other than those two. Now, there are versions of that in the history of many religions. There's certainly versions of that in many laws and legal policies that reign in various countries. We can also ask about healthcare and where research and money go. For instance, somebody pointed out to me that if all the money that was put into researching Viagra had gone to solving the scourge of breast cancer, we'd be in a different world. So, I mean, sometimes, in fact, the binary distinction works to support a hierarchy, and because when the binary starts to be more complex than you thought it was, then how are you gonna know and stay in your place of power, or how are you going to know and stay in a position of subordination from which you benefited, at least in traditional ways. You've fulfilled the appropriate role as a woman, and you've been appropriately thanked for that.
One of the reasons I think this question, cui bono, is so important is that I think it might point or help us see why this seems to be a unilaterally right-wing or totalitarian or religious attack on gender. I thought it was funny in reading Who's Afraid of Gender that Russia labeled gender a threat to national security.
Yeah.
The Vatican labeled it, I think, a threat to man.
Yes.
And that's interesting.
Yes.
So the question is, I mean, why Russia stands to benefit from keeping this hierarchy and not questioning gender, or why this would benefit the Vatican, or why in the United States this seems to be a predominantly right-wing issue.
Yeah. I'm not opposed to the question of who benefits, but I worry if that's the only operation of power we see, we may not be grasping the phenomenon. In other words, it could skew our approach, to the problem at hand. For instance, Russia, Putin's government has blended with the Russian Orthodox Church in a way that is unprecedented. There's no church-state distinction anymore, and
I didn't know that.
Yes, and he at the same time he's banned academic and popular work in lesbian and gay studies, for instance, or gay advocacy, which is considered to be counter to the nation. So heightening a certain kind of morality, sexual politics and morality, has the effect of defining Russia by virtue of certain idea of masculinity and femininity, and casting the European Union and the urban centers of the West as threats to national identity, the spirit of the nation, and the security of the nation. Because people know, and Viktor Orban clearly knows, that if you secure the family to reproduce the nation in a certain way, and you also infuse the defense of the nation with the defense of the family and the defense of gender, then you, or of sex as it's been defined within your culture, then you bring people on board. You get popular support, and especially if you're asking for that kind of support and saying there's a very fearsome enemy out there that is threatening to come through the door.
So reifying the gender binary earned support because it's sort of playing to what, for instance, the supporters of somebody like Orban in Hungary already believe, and it gives them an enemy?
Well, it gives them an enemy, but for Orban, I mean, who also opposes miscegenation, and he's been quite clear, he wants everyone to consider their sex as natural and immutable, right? I mean, and he also believes that this is a religious truth that has to be accepted, and that those who are introducing the language of gender, or who think that sex is not immutable or not clearly binary, that those folks are threatening the foundations of the nation. So Orban doesn't profit from that in a financial way, right? He doesn't do that, but he does seek to ground a certain notion of national unity and nationalism through keeping migrants out, through his opposition to miscegenation and his opposition to gender. He wants to keep the family in its traditional form. So for him, the best way of doing that is to say that the national version of the family is the natural one. So he uses the category of the natural to serve the national and the nationalistic.
It's interesting that, again, the attack on migrants goes with the attack on gender, and you mentioned earlier it also goes together with an attack on critical race theory, in the United States at least. And is this all sort of the same thing about giving the supporters an enemy or a scapegoat or something like this?
Well, it's not just a scapegoat, although it is. It's very intimate. You know, if you tell somebody that you're born a certain sex, but you don't have to stay that way, they're like, ah, don't talk to me like that. This is who I am.
Yeah.
Right? This is me, and it's always going to be me, and this is not changeable. Right? And yet they see someone else who does change, or someone else who doesn't fit in the existing boxes because they're intersexed or whatever. They can be frightened because if that person can do it, then does that mean that I can do it, or that what I take to be most fundamental about who I am is actually changeable? I don't want to think that thought, right? So you expunge the other, or you exclude the other, or banish the other, or censor the other as a way not to be reminded of the fact that, well, there are some things that can change. Many of us don't want to, I have no interest in, are quite comfortable with the sex we were assigned, and we're going along in life with that. But others are less sure and actually want the freedom to investigate, including a lot of young people, apparently, who are experimenting with pronouns and trying to figure out who they want to be and how they want to be.
Pronouns is something that I'd like to get to in a second. But you raised this question of freedom and the ability to change one's gender. And in the absence of a theory of gender, I'm not sure that we'd be able to really pin this down. But how would somebody whose mind has changed, they've thought their entire life that their gender was immutable, they're told that it can change, what are the sorts of things that somebody might do when they're given this freedom that would result in a change of gender? Is it
Well, the
actions?
scenario you lay out is an unlikely one.
Okay.
Okay, because most people who identify as trans or transsexual report not being at peace with their gender assignment from a very early age. So they live with a disturbance, with an alienation, or with a deep sense of suffering because it just does not feel right to them. And then suddenly they learn, oh, there are some options for you. You can legally change your sex. You can get some medical help or some psychological help. You can join a community, or you can be part of a world in which this is accepted and affirmed. So it's those kinds of cultural and institutional changes that allow for that movement. I think I'm resisting the idea of a theory of gender. You'll excuse me, because there are many theoretical things to say about gender, but a single unified theory of gender, I think, would be maybe laughable at this time. There's so many competing views, and I guess what's more important to me is that we keep the question open, that we allow and support gender studies programs, women's studies programs, gay, lesbian, queer, trans studies. Like, let these folks read and discuss. Don't shut them down, don't censor them, don't ban them. So my view at this moment in my life is not to put forth a new theory of gender, but rather to insist that we be able to think openly and well about these matters. And, you know, and I'm still learning, right? I mean, I'm but one author, and it would be silly if I had my own like little property, like, oh, this is my theory of gender, which I did. But one learns through conversation and reading and experience in ways that continue to open up my own horizons as well.
Can I know that you no longer abide by the theory of gender performativity, but
Well, I don't dispute it or
dispute
reject
it.
it.
Okay.
It's just, it's been revised several times, and it would take me a couple of hours to explain.
Well, a prima facie objection sort of comes to mind right now that I'm just curious about how you would respond to it. And you mentioned a lot of people who are trans, they have known their entire life that they weren't comfortable with the sex they were assigned at birth or something like this. And if they live in a society where they were unable to sort of perform the acts of the gender
Form the acts of the gender, yeah.
that they identify with, I'm wondering what gender they would be. And I guess the question is gender something that has to be performed, or can it be something also internal?
Absolutely.
And okay.
Yeah. No,
So it's
I've
about
never
how you
said it's
think
only.
as well.
I've never said it's only performed.
Okay, yeah, I want to attribute
that has never been
that to
my
you,
view.
but it's also something.
No, there's a
internal
whole
about how you think.
psychoanalytic dimension of my work that includes quite a lot of reflection on the internal psychic dynamics of gender, and also how people feel, and sometimes the contradictions between how they feel and how they act. So, I'm not a behaviorist, and I'm not a what is that called? Irving Goffman person who thinks you wear a mask and that's who you are. No, that's not me. I think we are formed. We're called we're treated as a boy. We're treated as a girl from the minute we enter the world. So those meanings are being attributed to us. They become part of what we know. They're the ways in which we orient ourselves. But at a certain point, it could be that one is, oddly enough, radically disoriented by the terms that are supposed to be orienting you. And what do you do then? And I guess I want to insist that there's a zone of suffering that has been covered over by naturalized ideas of binary gender, or the immutability of sex, which are two different issues. And that we should be more alert to that suffering and offer educational, ethical, medical policies that try to alleviate that suffering.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned experimenting with pronouns, and you just used the word terms. And I'm wondering how our language use affects our interpretation of gender.
Well, it does a lot. There's a question of how you're called, how you call yourself. When somebody treats you as a man or treats you as a girl, what ideas of manhood or girlhood are being communicated to you at that moment? But there's also the problem that different languages function differently with gender. So, for instance, in most East Asian languages, and perhaps you saw this in your recent experience in Japan, that you inflect the verb a certain way, depending on if it's a man or a woman who is acting, or whatever the verb might be. So it's not a subject exactly that precedes the verb, like this man acts. It's rather this is an acting, which gets inflected as masculine or feminine. So how does that mess with the grammatical habits we have for thinking about gender? The idea that gender is something you have, like what gender are you? I am a, it's my being, it's an existential predication, or it's something I have in the sense of, this is the gender I have taken on. These are all complex questions, and I think they play out a certain way in English that isn't always the same in other languages. So translation and gender is its own field of study, and it's quite illuminating.
Yeah. Interesting that you mentioned translation and gender, because I was thinking about how interesting it is that continental philosophy is often done in comparative literature departments in the United States.
Sometimes.
Yeah, rather than, a lot of philosophy departments, Columbia is an example of one that has really strong continental tradition and analytic tradition, but there are other schools that don't really blend this. And I was wondering, I mean, you seem like the right person to ask why it is often taught in comparative literature departments.
Well, um, I mean, I think it depends which part of the continental tradition you're talking about. So, for instance, if you're talking about post-structuralism or the theoretical world represented by Derrida and Foucault, they were fundamentally concerned with language and literature, both of them. So it makes sense. But it depends what, if you're talking about Schopenhauer or Hegel, less so. Not sure I've seen a Hegel seminar in a comp lit department, right? But, there are people who say Hegel's unreadable, and others, like Robert Pippin, who spent his life showing analytic philosophers that it is readable, and or even Jay Bernstein at the New School, who is trained as a continental philosopher, but talks almost exclusively to analytic philosophers at this point, and in order to make those arguments. So I think comp lit came in at a certain point because of post-structuralism and literary theory and its relationship to philosophy. But it may also be that very different approaches to language are to be found in a person like Levi-Nas, who comes after structuralism and the structuralist account of language. I suppose we could date it to something like that.
Well, I really appreciate your letting me use you as a sounding board for these questions about continental philosophy. One other thing
It sounds a little bit like a theory of gender to me, though, kind of like, what is it?
Continental philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know people who still hold to that divide in the same way. So you're the first time in many years.
Really?
Yeah, that I'm actually hearing this reduplicated.
In analytic department like this department, it seems like that's how people talk about
it.
They do
talk about it still.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. But
I'm not sure that's the case across this country. It's certainly not in the UK.
But what I wanted to ask
or Australia, for that matter,
is you mentioned psychoanalysis being very important for your work, and psychoanalysis is something that I'm very interested in more as a therapy. But I've done a number of episodes on psychoanalysis for the show. I talked with Jonathan Lear at Chicago all about Freud, and he's wonderful. And I've also talked to Slavoj Žižek a number of times, but he thinks more about psychoanalysis as a form of cultural criticism, I think. And I'm wondering how it functions broadly in your work.
Well, I think that that would be hard to recount. In Gender Trouble, a long time ago, I suggested that well, I was commenting on the fact that during the AIDS crisis in the U.S., that it was very often the case that it was hard to acknowledge the losses that gay people were experiencing, gay men in particular, and that there wasn't a public recognition of those losses, and there were very often problems with families, like you couldn't tell your mother or your father that your lover had died because they didn't know you had a lover, even though this has been the most important person to you for 5 years, or whatever it may be. So there's a question of the denial of grief, or the denial of loss, that Freud characterizes as melancholia. And the distinction between mourning and melancholia has been really important to my work. Usually, at least in his early essay on that, he talks about knowing what it is you've lost when you're mourning. But melancholia is a condition in which you've lost something, but you have no idea what it is, or you cannot name it. And then I just thought, well, how many people live with unnameable losses? Like, how many people live with losses they cannot share, or for which there is no name? So I've been doing a lot of work in my post-gender years on the question of who is grievable, like within wars, for instance. Why is it we grieve one group of people so emphatically, while other groups of people are considered as dispensable?
This will be interesting if we talk about Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, well, we'll see if we can get there.
You've mentioned inclusion a lot in this conversation, and from speaking with many psychoanalysts, I know that they think that psychoanalysis has an inclusion problem because of how expensive it is as a therapy.
Yeah.
Some analysts, like Jonathan Lear, don't actually charge anything, which is laudable, but most have very lofty rates because it takes a lot of training, and therapy is many times a week and for many years. And I'm curious then if you view it more as a tool for your analysis as a philosopher, or if you also think it's a worthwhile treatment. Like, have you been analyzed by any chance?
Well, I've certainly had therapy that's psychoanalytically informed. But I mean, Jonathan Lear, for whom I have great admiration, luckily has a good salary at the University of Chicago, and he's an amazing person in many ways. And it doesn't surprise me that generous acts are attributed to him, because that is definitely what he does. I think psychoanalysis can also be a form of cultural criticism. Slavoj, I'm sure, agrees with that. I think psychotherapy can be offered to people at an affordable rate that brings insights from psychoanalysis into it. And I think we also have forms of social work that are informed by psychoanalysis, that are publicly financed, or at least partially so. So I think there's different access to it. I mean, people read it, they write dissertations about it. It's also an academic field, and professionals also have an academic, professional analysts have an academic dimension, which is clinical and remains extremely important, at least in parts of the world that haven't disputed psychoanalysis altogether. And so, I think it needs to be popularly available. I think it should be more affordable, but for that to happen, there would have to be public funding and support, and also it would have to be part of the kinds of psychological services that are covered by insurance.
One thing that might be of interest to some of our listeners is I have heard that if you go through a psychoanalytic institute, which these exist in big cities,
Yes.
you can often find psychoanalysts in training who can lower their rate significantly, especially if you're in need, because they need their training.
That's right. They need to amass a certain number of hours, and they charge at a lower rate. You may not get the experience of an older psychoanalyst, but you might get a more open mind, somebody who's kind of thinking anew about psychoanalysis.
There are two other topics that I wanted to make sure that we touched on a bit today, just because they're very topical right now, especially the first one heading into November, and that's the election and then Israel and Palestine. And I guess the first question is, how do you see the topics that you discuss in Who's Afraid of Gender bearing on the election and the election's outcomes, obviously?
Yeah. Well, I think, well, I'm not sure there has to be a direct bearing on my book and the elections, because in my mind, politics is larger than elections, although elections are really important, and this one is especially so. But Trump is somebody who sought, when he was president, to stipulate that what's called gender should actually be understood as sex, and that sex should be regarded as immutable. And he tried to put it into law. And even his own Health and Human Services Department told him that he couldn't do that. That is just not right. It won't work. That there are too many things that get in the way of that. And I think that the politics of hatred, of stoking hatred, of finding hatred exciting or exhilarating, rely on casting aspersions on minority communities or vulnerable communities more broadly. So people who are already vulnerable in this world are then subject to hatred or to vicious forms of degradation at the level of language, but sometimes through action, through violence and discrimination. I think that Trump speaks so many falsehoods, and we have to ask ourselves, why is it people are ready to believe falsehoods? What is it about his lying in particular that leads people to accept what he says? And I guess my theory is that they actually know he's lying. They know he's exaggerating. They know that nothing grounds many of his claims, but they're thrilled with the idea that he's able to say whatever he wants and make it seem true, even though there's no evidence to support it, and even though it's incoherent, right? So he defies standards of evidence, non-contradiction, coherence all the time. And I think that there are people who are angry or feel under-recognized, who support Trump and feel that he defies all the usual laws. And so they vote for somebody who uses the law to his own advantage and also doesn't actually believe in constitutional law or hold himself accountable to basic standards of evidence. So I think we haven't thought enough about that right-wing right-wing thrill, that sense of exhilaration that people get with their MAGA rallies and the like. But I think there is a kind of hatred of education, clearly, of the elites, but also a hatred of the left, its progressive programs, what seems like censorship or super egoic maneuvering on the left. They want to be free to hate. They want to be free to be irrational. And he represents that very dangerous and misguided form of liberation. I think those, what I call fascist passions, like you can have fascist passions running through a democracy. You don't have to have a fascist state to have fascist passions running through the populace. But anti-gender on the right is a fascist passion, in my view, and it's one that propels people to accept increasingly authoritarian regimes and to question the value of constitutional democracy itself, including the separation of powers, for instance. So to the degree that Who's Afraid of Gender does try to assess the kind of phantasms that are circulated to provoke and escalate fascist passions, I think we can draw an analogy to what Trump and Vance do when they start spouting lies, and when they start making hatred exciting.
If Trump were to be elected, what sorts of actions would he take or his supporters take that would harm trans people or
Well,
women?
let's remember
Or
feminism is what has used gender more than any other group, right? So we talk about gender equality, we talk about gender-based violence. So to be against gender is to be against a number of progressive movements and laws that have sought to protect people against violence, or that have sought to secure the rights to reproductive health for women and other pregnant people. So we could see state powers augmented over questions like abortion. We could see the rolling back of the right to gay marriage. And we could see the restriction of health care to gender nonconforming people, including trans people, as we see in Texas and elsewhere where it's actually criminalized. So, yeah, there are a lot of people who stand to suffer under a second Trump regime.
And on the other side, the Harris side, I know that many people do not think that she is far left enough, even though they're happy now to have her as the candidate. But what does her platform represent for the future for you if she is elected?
Well, right now, my basic hope is that she can garner enough votes in the right states to stop Trump from reassuming power. So
it's more an anti-Trump hope.
Yes, I have an anti-Trump. Ward that off. Ward that off. To what degree she will turn out to be different from Biden, I don't know. I oppose her support for fracking. I think she could have a stronger role in the Middle East to bring about a just and durable peace. I'm not convinced on either front that she will do that. But I don't know whether there's something that she's envisioning that I think is better for this country, except that she does affirm the rule of law, and in particular, the distinguishing features of constitutional democracy. I mean, the reason Trump is so terribly frightening is that he could take aim at democratic institutions. And, this is the paradox we live in, that democracies can produce autocrats and fascists who then attack the democratic institutions by which they were elected. So I'd like to see I'd like to see constitutional democracy preserved in the United States, and I do think Harris would do that.
Even though you're best known professionally for working on gender, it seems like that's not the central issue for you in this election. In this election, what's most central to you is the preservation of constitutional democracy.
It is, and I would add reproductive rights and the rights of vulnerable communities, civil rights. I wish she were better on migration. I can only hope that she will improve her position, but on migration, on the environment, on the Middle East, I'm not a big fan, but certainly there are some important social and human rights issues that she understands, and legal issues.
At the outset of your response, you said that politics are bigger than elections.
Yeah.
And what I wonder is whether you see this election, though, as having the possibility of having a broader ripple effect across the world for gender and sex-related issues, and for that reason, this election being much bigger than just one in the United States.
Well, it is bigger for sure because of the power that the United States has on the rest of the world, economically and politically. But we also we see autocratic regimes in Turkey and in Hungary and now in Argentina as well. At the same time, we see certain leaders deposed, like in Poland and in Brazil, who were in fact anti-democratic in their style of rule. So it's kind of up in the air. What's the future of democracy? And we need to struggle to preserve it and to define it in a more robust and persuasive way.
Well, the other big issue that I wanted to make sure we touched on, which I've already mentioned, is Israel and Palestine. And one reason I wanted to talk about it with you, you already mentioned that you spent a lot of time in synagogue, that you have a Jewish background, but also you wrote a book called Parting Ways.
Yes.
That touches on these issues. And the first question that I have is one of the common refrains that's often heard today is that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And since this is in large part something you were dispelling in your book, I thought I ought to ask you the overview of your thoughts on this refrain and why it's wrong.
Well, I think it's important. It's a very ahistorical and highly politicized formulation to say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It wasn't until the 1970s that anti-Zionism became an example of anti-Semitism, but now it's the norm, if not the defining norm. And of course, the Jewish people have always debated about Zionism, what it means, what it doesn't mean. And before the middle of the 19th century, it was not a big deal in Jewish life. It was not even an idea. There were, of course, references biblically to the return to a homeland or to the notion of Zion, but people were living in diasporic communities and there was no sense of a return to Palestine, at least not a broad sense. It wasn't until the Zionist World Congresses convened in the late 19th century that we started to get differences in Zionist views. So there were some who thought, let's go take that land. There are no people there, but like Herzl said, it's a land without a people, and we are a people without a land. But in fact, the land was inhabited. So the formulation effaced the fact that Palestinians were there. But there were other Zionists who were cultural, who thought, no, we don't need a state, like Franz Rosenzweig in Germany in the teens and 20s said, we don't need a state. That would be the end of the spiritual value of Judaism. And then there were the socialists, the Bundists, who didn't want Zionism, who wanted an international socialist form of Jewish life. And for them, socialism and Jewishness were linked. And there were other religious people, the Orthodoxy among them, who were not Zionists. And this has continued until today. And almost every Jewish dinner table I know is one that is rife with dispute. People just don't agree. It's a really hard topic to talk about because people have a lot of passions. And what I worry is that people don't know the history of Zionism, and they don't also know the way in which Zionism participated in a colonial discourse. Although there were open debates about that. Hans Kohn, he went to Palestine in the 30s, Viennese Jewish politician and political theorist, with the aim of helping to build a Zionist state, and was so appalled by the colonizing practices that he left. And so, there's for me, Jewishness and the reading of the Talmud, for instance, it's all about disputation. It's all about having a raucous dinner table and people having different points of view. Nobody has ever said, oh, you must have this point of view to be Jewish. That would be highly contestable according to the protocols and the spirit of the debate that I know from my Jewish education. So I remain very strongly identified as a Jew, and I'm lucky to have a progressive synagogue in Oakland, and I belong to Jewish Voice for Peace. It's extremely important for me to be Jewish. I have Jewish values, and I read Jewish literature and philosophy still, so I never really abandoned that formation. But I haven't been a Zionist for, I don't know, goodness, maybe 40 years. And that was not particularly remarkable until recently. But what worries me is that the idea that to be a Zionist is to somehow defend everything that Netanyahu does. It's like, I don't think so. To be a Zionist is to be complicit with the genocidal actions against Palestine. Well, if you say that, then you're actually assuming that the political form of Zionism that is currently exemplified by the Israeli state represents Zionism in totality. And I think that's probably a mistake, and a pretty nefarious one. So, but I worry that the terms of debate have become terrible. If you're an anti-Zionist Jew and you oppose Hamas, like me, then you're called a Zionist. But if you're an anti-Zionist, you're called Hamas. So from both sides, I get certain kinds of criticism, but that's because the terms of debate are mirroring the terms of war. So for those of us who want to think beyond war or even against war, we need to open up these histories and allow for greater complexity into these discussions.
What was it that changed 40 years ago when you went from Zionist to not?
Oh,
what
well,
did you
I
think
called
before?
myself post-Zionist for a while to show that I had been brought up Zionist for sure. And I accepted a lot of stories and teachings that I had received as a child. And then I went to university, and I actually met other Jewish people from my same city who told me I needed to read some things and that there were analogies between the state of Israel and apartheid South Africa. When I first heard it, I just said, no, that's not possible. That's an outrageous idea. But then I started reading, and I saw the violent dispossession by which the state was founded. And unfortunately, the mechanisms of dispossession and violence that were part of that founding have continued throughout the history of Israel. What I would love to see is, indeed, here again, a constitutional democracy that could have been installed in 48, but was not. The principles of Jewish sovereignty triumphed over a constitutional democracy, but a state in which everybody has equal rights, equal freedom, equal access to justice, regardless of race, religion, and the rest, would clearly take apart the quite terrible structure we're seeing, which is absolutely unlivable, especially for Palestinians. And I would think that Israeli Jews would feel safer living on conditions of equality, because then there wouldn't be an uprising every other moment. People do want to be free and equal. And these are fundamental democratic passions, and they should be honored throughout the world and there as well.
Especially since at the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned that a lot of your early research was on Nazism. It seems like you're a good person to ask this question. Another of the refrains often heard, but not from the same side, is that Gaza is like a concentration camp. And this is disputed by some people, accepted by some people. I also know that you lost a lot of your family in the Holocaust. So I was wondering if you think that this is an apt comparison, at least for some reasons.
Well, I don't know if I've heard that Gaza is a concentration camp. I think that I've heard that it has some aspects to it that are like the Jewish ghetto.
Okay.
But, I think we need to take a step back, because there are Israelis who claim that the Palestinians are the new Nazis, right? And then there are Palestinian affiliates or advocates who claim that that Israelis' actions are Nazi. And, that's one historical period, and we keep bringing all the sides back into that historical period when actually the situation there is one of abiding colonization and state violence of a sort that needs to be described in its history and in its specificity without getting bound up with these kinds of analogies. I think analogies of that kind lead us astray. In the same way, you could say that Israel's actions are genocidal, but that doesn't mean that Israel is a Nazi regime. It means that genocide takes many different forms, and we need to attend to the jurisprudence to understand which of those forms is being imposed now.
Another thing I wanted to ask about was how you think this problem or this war, I guess, would be solved. And here there are two dimensions to this. There's how should it ideally be solved, and then how could it practically be solved?
Well, I think the United States would have to stop delivering military weapons to the state of Israel. And I think a broader coalition of Palestinian parties would have to assume control in any negotiation. I think more broadly, Palestinians, all the people of that land, Jews, Palestinians, and others who live there, have to be able to live in a state structure, either one state or two state, that guarantees equality, protection against violence, and freedom, including freedom of political self-determination, political participation. The Palestinians are stateless people. They live under administrative structures, but they don't have a state of their own, nor are they welcome in the Israeli state as equal citizens. So one or the other. But whatever form it is, it has to be based on equality, justice, and freedom. And we know this already, but somehow we think we can turn away from what we know in this case. But I think we cannot, and we're seeing it in the horrific bloodshed and anguish on all sides.
Well, Judith, this has been terrific. Thank you for taking the time to drive down here from Berkeley, because I'm sure it was very, very difficult, but it was really great. Thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you. I'm glad to talk with you.